Welcome. Thank you for coming out on a Friday evening. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Dean of the College of Environmental Design, and I want to congratulate you, actually, for coming out to hear what will be I'm sure, a very exciting lecture by Barbara Marie Stafford, Professor Emerita at the University of Chicago. Tonight's lecture, as well as the lectures that were held on Wednesday and Thursday evenings and delivered by Professor Paul Collier from Oxford University and Janine Benyus, they spoke respectively on Haiti and the bottom billion and how to approach the huge challenge of global poverty on fragile states. And Janine Benyus, who talked about biomimicry, biomimetic design, and what that means for the field of environmental design. It was extremely inspiring. Also, tomorrow morning's lectures by Manuel Castells of USC and Dana Cuff from UCLA, which will be held in the Worcester Hall Auditorium. All of these activities have been organized as part of the College of Environmental Design's 50th anniversary celebration. Last fall, we began the revelry, if you will, and paid tribute to the college's history. These events featured a series of distinguished alumni that have done all kinds of interesting work, and also emeriti faculty, the voices of wisdom and remembrance. And they also included major lectures by the architectural historian Del Upton and Sir Peter Hall of the Bartlett School. And I think everyone agreed at the time that there was a lot to celebrate. In 1959, the college was established as the first school that thought it would be useful to integrate the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and city and regional planning all under one roof in one venue. They thought it was important to have an integrated approach and also to bring other kinds of voices into the discussion of how to build cities, landscapes, the public realm, and individual structures. And those voices included scientists, physicists, mechanical engineers, mathematicians, sociologists, psychologists, and systems engineers. And they actually created a very rich brew and dialogue and debate in the college about how cities should be built, how design process should unfold, and how different kinds of constituencies should be involved in the entire process. So these were very heady days and very productive days indeed. And one might argue, certainly I would, as dean, I would argue that the college led the way to what happened all across the country in environmental design education. At the same time, the college has also brought a uniquely social and activist perspective to design, and always been concerned with linking theory to practice in what we call design activism. And that's something that led to people working on housing for the homeless, working with community organizations to design parks and gardens, and also a whole variety of efforts to make cities more livable and democratic. One of the problems with having a historical legacy is that the stakes are kind of high. So, you know, it's the 50th anniversary. What do we do next? What's the encore? How do we go from? Where do we go from here? And I think that my answer to that is that we need to be as bold and as innovative as we were in 1959, even though the future that we are thinking about and that in many ways we know is unfolding is radically different than the one people were thinking about in 1959. And so this will mean rethinking and re-theorizing the process and dynamics of urbanization, how politics, global politics and economics affect the shape and distribution and functioning of cities. It will mean thinking about sustainable, high-performance buildings that can meet goals such as zero energy and zero waste and in water reuse, for example. And it will also mean learning how to work with incredibly diverse constituencies, interest groups, participants in the process who are at the table as we think about who has a voice, how is that articulated, and what is the result for the shape of the cities to come, and the human settlements that will evolve in what Paul Collier, for example, said will be an urban world. Well, that is a challenge, and so this semester, which is really the second part of our 50th celebration, which begins this week, we're going to grapple with these challenging questions. And we are doing so through an exploration or explorations of some of the most challenging questions, whether they be climate change, global poverty, economic collapse, mortgage foreclosure communities, and all the rest. And through this process, we also hope to have a glimpse of some of the most intriguing and different ways of thinking about environmental design. Last night, Janine Benyus, for example, talked to us about harnessing models from the natural world to reshape the materials that we use, the way we think about construction and the design of products and structures and in even communities, and how we can use those biomimetic devices to rethink and redesign the metabolism of cities to protect our ecosystems, our nature services, and our climate. Tonight, we're going to explore a very different set of models and ideas that may guide our future thinking and in fact, our teaching. And here I'm speaking of what we are going to hear from Barbara Stafford, who will talk to us, I believe, about models of cognitive science and neurobiology and how to use those understandings from those fields to understand human attention, visual perception of the world, and ultimately creativity, which we know lies at the core and the heart of environmental design. Just as a heads up for tomorrow, Manuel Castells is going to talk in the morning about how grassroots movements around the world are emerging to reshape the city, its politics, and its spaces. And also on Saturday, we have dedicated ourselves to listening to carefully to the voices of our younger generations, our assistant professors, recent alumni, and even graduate students as they debate the future of our college and community. And some people have told me that this was really risky. You never know what they're going to come up with and what they're going to demand. But we want to, we think they have really good ideas and insights for us at all levels as we rethink how we're going to move forward and how we think about the kinds of theoretical explorations that ought to drive our work and the modes of practice that we might develop and evolve in order to tackle the challenges that lie ahead. So I hope that if you haven't already signed up, you will join us tomorrow morning. It's my pleasure to introduce now Michael Dear, who will in turn introduce Barbara. Professor Dear is a member of the Department of City and Regional Planning here in the College of Environmental Design, where he just arrived this year and is teaching courses on the US-Mexican border and also courses on urban theory. He's trained as a geographer, town planner, and regional scientist. Sounds arcane, and I think it is, from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Dear taught at McMaster University and then at the University of Southern California, where he directed the Southern California Studies Center, which I'm tripping up on it because everybody just called it SC2. He's the author and editor of more than a dozen books, and these books seem to have come in waves. Books on urban planning and the capitalist state, on mental health, deinstitutionalization, and homelessness, on postmodern urbanism and the LA School of Urban Theory, and art and culture on the US-Mexican border and the dynamics of transborder cities. Professor Dear is also the founding editor of Environment and Planning D, Society and Space, which is one of the preeminent journals that looks at space from an urban space from a multidisciplinary perspective. His honors, which are many, include a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Research Honors Award from the Association of American Geographers. He's currently writing a book on the emergence of a third nation along the US-Mexican border. So Michael, over to you to introduce our esteemed guest. Thank you.
Good evening. Of course, it's a pleasure to hear Dean Walsh go on and on about my merits, and if Barbara was not here, I would simply have encouraged her to continue. It's so interesting. Sorry. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And welcome to everybody. I'd like to take a second just to thank everybody who's put these projects together. Too numerous to mention. I don't want to pick anybody out in particular, but a lot of work's gone into these presentations, and I'd like to thank everybody for what they did. I'd also like to thank you all for coming, because tonight is going to be a dynamic evening. Tonight, we feature Barbara Maria Stafford, who's an art historian by training, a professor emerita at the University of Chicago, where she was formerly William Ogden Distinguished Service Professor. I've learned since Barbara's arrival that she's recently accepted an appointment at Georgia Tech, and we're all very pleased about that. And what you don't know, and what I didn't know, is that she's been hired to create a cross-disciplinary program that involves art, all engineering schools on campus, and other science-oriented disciplines to create a new program that crosses the humanities and science and cultural studies. She is actually, I think, a unique person for this, and I wish her all bon voyage on that development. I'm also looking forward to her next book, which comes out soon from a series of Templeton seminars that were held in previous years. Barbara is a truly distinguished professor and distinguished scholar in her field, and in recent years she's turned her attention to the link between the humanities and the way the brain works. Now that's a connection that sometimes in fact rarely we actually make. It involves a two-way exchange where humanists learn to make sense of the neuroscience, specifically the physical and chemical reactions to certain cultural objects like a painting or whatever. And also it involves neuroscientists advancing towards the humanities to make sure that their investigations into the brain is not simply confined to physical reactions, but deal with emotions, feelings such as distaste, bliss, indifference, and awe, etc., what we might call in academic terms the phenomenological basis for thought. Now, we don't have a very good handle on that. You know, when we look at images and people's reactions, who knows how they work? I mean, for example, just to give you a small personal example, there's, you know, the actress with the big teeth, Julia Roberts, right? I can't stand Julia Roberts. Nothing in life is going to make me change this opinion. Sorry. And I know she's America's sweetheart, but I don't like her. And she can't act. Now, that's emotional, that's cognitive in all sorts of levels, and it's totally beyond explanation as far as I'm concerned, but I don't care because I feel it so strongly. Now, Barbara, on the other hand, takes this matter much more seriously. It's a relationship. What we're interested in, and I was very struck by when I first met her, was the relationship between how we perceive and act and respond to images. And this, of course, includes things like cities, traffic, people, and so on. So it's transparently a question in environmental design, the relationship between the hard city of material structures and the soft city, the cognitive structures in our minds. And this, of course, is why Barbara is here to help us celebrate our birthday. Barbara Stafford is a remarkable woman. I have to be kind of careful about how I express this in the company that I'm in, but she truly is. I first met her 2 or 3 years ago when she gave a brilliant series of lectures at that other university in Southern California, which had a formerly good football team, and I don't mean UCLA, followed by a retreat where a small group conversed more deeply about what she was talking about. Toward the end of a retreat, a friend and colleague of ours, Hilary Shaw, she's an English professor and consequently rarely at a loss for words, she described Barbara's presentation in the following terms. Barbara Stafford is a visionary and a prophet. The others who follow write the laws. And you can make what you will of that, but you'll see what she meant when you hear Barbara's presentation. Just to give you a flavor of what she's interested in, and I know she wants me to finish, but this is my 5 minutes of glory, Barbara. My favorite book is Echo Objects. which came out in 2007, was subtitled The Cognitive Work of Images. It's about feeling and place. And just to give you a short version, because I'm getting signs from Barbara that she wants to take the podium, what art does is it enables us to observe the space inside our bodies. It gives face to a secret life of consciousness. And it needs science and art, science and the humanities, to bring these perspectives together, I think, to avoid reducing human feelings to a galaxy of neurons, awash in neurotransmitters and dispersed in synaptic circuitry. These are her words, not mine. Apart from writing very polished prose, she adds a little human touch by saying that when brain science and cultural configurations come together, Barbara says our work gains an added bounce. It's the added bounce which I think is the value added in a lot of what Barbara's work is about. In her own brilliant performances, she creates a perfect foil for the way she wants us to think. And I'm not going to spoil her presentation by telling you how she does that. It's up to you to find it out. I will tell you, however, that we are in for an entertaining and instructive evening, and you can look forward to an exciting ride. Would you please join me in welcoming Barbara Maria Stafford?
That is a terrible setup, as any actor knows. I thank you so much, and I'm profoundly honored to be here to celebrate this lovely birthday, and to be asked, actually, since I am not a design historian, to do this. I hope I will add some value, however. What I want to do this evening is sink deeper. If one thinks of the kind of stratigraphy or even the topography that the Dean so beautifully outlined that you've been listening to, the question I want to ask, and it's one that's been preoccupying me since Echo Objects, is that it seems to me that there is absolutely no doubt that the problems that we used to think problems that belonged exclusively to the humanities, to the social sciences, are now problems that are no longer our own. They are, if one looks at the work on affect, if one looks on social behavior, if one looks at neuroeconomics, if one looks absolutely on decision-making processes, the neurosciences, the brain sciences are there. And what I would like to propose and place before us this evening is a suggestion that we actually share issues in common, and we're going to have to find, it seems to me programmatically, educationally, ways in which to define issues that deeply engage us across the aisle, so that we are not simply financially collapsed, which is what happens, constricted in contemporary educational institutions, but that we come together of our own will around new areas. And it seemed to me that the problem that would be quite pertinent, and it certainly is important to architecture and to design, written tout court, is the problem of the vanishing of what I call selective attention and attentiveness. So that is my topic this evening. And everything that I have to say is about asking you to think about the potential for collaboration. And I'm going to work high. The only way that one can collaborate, I spent 7 years in the computational neuroscience workshop at the University of Chicago, because it's one thing to read this material, it's quite another to understand it in the bone. And I also taught and took my students into laboratories and in vice versa, which is the only way that you deal. It seems to me that one can have anything that can credibly be called interdisciplinarity. I mean, that word is meaningless to my mind unless you do that. My topic this evening, then, is slow looking. I'm going to speak about slowness and about the concept of attentiveness. I'm sorry, I don't have my little, oh, I do have my little clicker, pardon me. Pardon me, I do have it. I want to begin with a quotation from the British poet W.H. Auden. He is usually, of course, known for his brilliant poetry, but he's actually a superlative writer on theology. And this is from some of his occasional writing on religion. And as you listen to this quote, you might think of the Buddhist concept of mindfulness. I show it to you in conjunction with this beautiful Runge, German romantic Runge, and it in a way sums up what I'm going to be wrestling with. This is Auden. To pray is to pay attention, or shall we say to listen to someone or something other than oneself. Whenever a man so concentrates his attention, be it on a landscape, or a poem, or a geometrical problem, or an idol, or the true God, that he completely forgets his own ego and desires. In listening to what the other has to say, he is praying. Auden goes on and says that what he is getting at is the opposite of petitionary prayer. Petitionary prayer, where, of course, you ask for something. That's not about that. Instead, I'm going to propose to you that what it seems to me that he is seeking is something closer to the category of wonder, of being absolutely present to something or to someone in a particular context, in a particular moment in time and space. I want to turn, with that Auden quote in mind, to a contemporary installation called It Doesn't Matter by the Czech curator and installation artist Katarina Seda, and I show you actually the protagonist of this really brilliant and extraordinary piece, which constitutes or comprises something like 500 drawings. In this, if I have any neuroscientists in the audience, in this parsimonious diagrammatic style, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, it shows Seda's grandmother, Jana, who, after the death of her husband, no longer dressed herself, she didn't wash, she didn't clean, she didn't go out, she only watched television. I want to invoke, at this point, the beautiful work of the French neuroscientist Jean-Pierre Changeux. Changeux, in his 1993 book called Raison et Plaisir, Reason and Pleasure, where he first puts forward his global workspace theory of how our mind works, puts forward a theory that should interest the designers in this audience. It is about the centrality of voluntary, and this is the sub-theme of my lecture this evening, the way in which memory and voluntary attentiveness, the kind that we saw here, the kind that we saw in the Runge painting, is a fundamental component in the creative process of higher level synthetic brain functioning. Not involuntary, but voluntary. And I will make that, that distinction clear. In other words, just as we see in the Katarina Seda piece, what is quite extraordinary is that the effective qualities of a work of art prompt something extraordinary. That is, all those long-term memory processes, things that we thought were submerged, that were gone. Jana's past, which I will say something about in a moment, can be revived and can be put to work in conscious present memory processing, so that Changeux finds that the aesthetic and the creative is absolutely important to the higher level synthesis that goes on in the brain. That artistic creativity and its connection to memory are actually deeply, deeply imbricated. Why does that relate to this? For 33 years, Jana had been the head of what was essentially the Home Depot store at Brunn in Czechoslovakia. And what is extraordinary, this woman who had fallen into the deepest depression, who didn't even dress herself anymore, at the end of Seda's project, produced 650 drawings of everything from putty knives to saw blades and spanners, mops and ladders, typewriters, vacuum cleaners, everything that was in the store, and even more remarkably, their prices. Everyone, their prices. In other words, it was precisely the ability to seize again and voluntarily to do that, to do it quite on purpose, to bring conscious and unconscious processes together, that is quite extraordinary. It actually, this insight of Changeux, I say it for the phenomenologists in the crowd, in Changeux's later conversations with Paul Ricoeur, this comes back over and over again. But I want to take it to another dimension. I want to point out that this exercise and this production of diagrammatic, I mean, you understand that these are not full-fledged, but it's the quintessencing that is brought forward from the past and applied, and that comes to live again in the present moment, that gives also superb evidence for neuroplasticity, another rather wonderful thing that those of us in architecture and design and in the visual arts generally need to take a hold of. That is that one learns throughout life. It's not simply a matter of hard wiring at birth. Or if I can quote the beautiful phrase by the dancer Yvonne Rainer, she reminds us, the mind is a muscle. If you don't exercise it, you lose it. But let me return with that in mind to Auden's prayer analogy. In Runge's Small Morning, the historians can say to me, yes, it is, and you notice it is non-petitionary prayer. It is exactly being present to something or someone. It is also, of course, historically an example of Christian agape, non-erotic love, although eroticism is also a rather perfect example of the kind of attentiveness that I'm after. That is a kind of shared love where one is invaded by an irresistible power that one consents to and rejoices in. I'm trying, and I'm going to back into this throughout the course of my lecture, I'm trying to get at the quality of what one, or how one defines this thing that one calls a kind of alert, voluntary, conscious attentiveness. Consequently, it is the opposite of human indifference. It seems to me that that certainly links up to some of the things that you mentioned, that your dean mentioned, was discussed by earlier speakers. That is, without conscious attention, indifference looms its head. And I want to invoke here for the technologists and again for the scientists in the audience that it seems to me that we really need one another. That is, the humanities and social sciences need the neurosciences, but the neurosciences require us. Because I think an aperçu that those of us from the humanistic side of the aisle might bring is the comment that there is an extraordinary difference between the language of automaticity, which drives so much neural research, which comes out of what? Cybernetics, and the language and discourse, as you see in the German Romantics, of spontaneity, which comes out of biology, out of evolutionary biology. If I have any Evo-Devo people here, you will understand what I'm speaking of. Those are two separate and extremely distinct concepts. You see, by the way, the spontaneity incarnated rather beautifully in the meta frame, and picture within a picture, and in those blossom children, which, as Buffon commented when he spoke about spontaneity, he said spontaneity is in fact how life is formed and shaped. Cybernetics, as you know from Norbert Wiener, derives from those technologies, both of imprisonment and liberation, computers and computation. And it's interesting to me that there's a recent spate of books now coming out of MIT that actually is leveling an interesting critique about how IT generally has invaded almost every aspect of research in every discipline, whether one recognizes it or not. I quote Stanley Kubrick on the limits, very interesting comment by Stanley Kubrick on the limits of computation and the limits of the computer, when he says the problem is not that computers start to act like people, but rather that people start to act like computers. And the area that I want to take up, attentiveness, my argument will be, requires another lost concept, not only the value of the slow, but the value of hesitancy. Hesitating, that hesitating is not an evil. It is something one does when one is facing complexity. This is Nicholas Carr, who says it rather differently from a book from MIT called Does IT Matter? This is a quote from Nicholas Carr. We are transferring our intelligence into the machine, and the machine is transferring its way of thinking into us. And here is the speed element. And we are beginning to process information as if we are nodes, with the speed emphasis. All right, then you might well say to me, what is the opposite of my topic? I'm going to show you a series of 6 game faces. This is from a series done by Philip Toledano, I should just say that I am not against game design. I think there's some extremely interesting designs. This you can probably tell. These are people actually looking at a certain kind of game, probably a first-person shooter. I want to make the point that this is not my topic. What we're looking at here is the captive or ensnared, very specific computer player. That is someone whose reward systems have been targeted automatically and who is not aware that he is unaware. These are the faces. I'm going to use the language of film theory to also explicate this. What we're looking at has also to do with a kind of addiction. New, very interesting work, again, from the brain sciences on extreme memory, which asks the question, why is it that an addict, I don't care what you're addicted to, after having gone off, when that person reverts, why? It is such an extreme reversion when one would expect it would not be. The inability to still an image, the inability to pause an image is what we see here. There's absolutely no self-control. There's no biology of freedom, certainly, that is in evidence here. The inability of the nervous system, because it's the nervous system, of course, that's being targeted, the limbic system as well. The inability of an overstretched nervous system to move away from a state of exhaustion, fatigue, and, as it were, go back to something, to another point. As I have this on the screen, I also, since I said something about cybernetics, I want to quote to you from Norbert Wiener's memoir, because Norbert Wiener, aptly named and modestly named memoir called Ex-Prodigy. Well, I mean, he was brilliant. Norbert Wiener writes about he gives a very interesting and proleptic definition of cybernetics. But he writes more broadly about self-referential, probabilistic forms of thought connected with theories of messages and communications. I mean, of course, this is just one extension of it. And he defines cybernetics quite futuristically as a science of control or the prediction of future action, as well as a science of form. And he goes on to predict exactly what you encounter now in San Francisco or in O'Hare and any airport across the world. What he called intention detecting processes. That is how we, again, automatically process the actions of others, and the fact that we do most of that unknowingly. And I foreground that because you recall my theme is knowingness. I should also say at this point that some of that has very interestingly crept back into brain research. I'm struck increasingly. Not only has brain research been enormously influential in founding fields like neuroeconomics, but I'm rather struck by the way in which economics has now influenced the concepts of brain research, and precisely on this point. The new master narrative in many of the writings out there is on the growth of productivity. Productivity is a key thing, the brain as a kind of productive generation, again, a kind of speed, an organ for speed, mental productivity. And I would say, again, to my colleagues across the aisle, that there is very scant guidance for what might be called, what I would like to term, the biology of freedom, that tiny voluntarism that I began with. The second sign of the influx of a certain kind of economics is the language of deregulation. The deregulation of the prefrontal cortex's executive control. There is no executive control. You just read Daniel Dennett. It is all third-person consciousness. And this deregulation, which allows not only a media targeting, as you see in the games, but also a pharmacological targeting of certain areas. And so I conclude by saying that just as the scientists are searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, that is what makes us an integrated, what gives us an integrated, coherent consciousness, just as we, as humanists, ask that question phenomenologically, it seems to me that one has to get out of a kind of sectional pursuit of self-interest, and at the same time that question offers a wonderful way to get psychology and neurology together, to get the mind science of the humanities and the brain sciences of neurobiology together. So I now come to the main part of my paper. This is my topic. If we actually look, and I want to, if the scientists work from the inside out, I want to ask this question from the outside in. If we actually look at how human beings behave when they involve themselves in more complex activities, in thinking, communicating, investigating, observing, teaching, you all are pedagogues in some ways, they slow down and they hesitate. So my topic today, and I take it a beautiful phrase from those lovely neuroscientists, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, who changed their minds. It's really quite beautiful. Their late work, which hardly anybody knows because it's only in Spanish, it's not been translated, when they changed their view entirely of autopoiesis and said, no, of course, the openness to the environment, that the brain is not entirely an autopoietic system. It is also open, it takes in, it changes, and therefore really foresaw the kind of neural Darwinism that Gerald Edelman is so wonderfully developing. This is the phrase from Maturana and Varela: to live is to know. To live is to know, and they mean by this, I believe, that human interaction is based on the present moment of meaningful experience, attention, attentiveness. I show you here Annie Leibovitz's photograph of Kazuyo Sejima examining a model of the recently opened Museum of Contemporary Art in New York's Bowery, which is a kind of, speaking of empathetic mimicry, it's, I mean, really kind of wonderful photograph that she took, contemplating this very complex model, which of course varies whether it's overcast or in the sunlight. It becomes rather mirage-like, and also, I mean, sort of scrutinizing the this off-kilter tower, but thinking, and this photograph actually made me think more generally. What are the different types of thought? What are the different looks of people actually thinking? What are the results of that? This is Kazuyo Sejima's addition to the Toledo Museum of Art, the glass pavilion that she finished in 2006, which, before you dismiss it as a kind of Philip Johnson, you know, see-through box, it's totally different, where inside and outside, it's actually much closer to a kind of the new environmental, the new eco art, because the curved walls, which you can barely see actually in my photograph, create a kind of mirage where inside actually hovers in this narrow space between, and is so different. I mean, this kind of meditative space, which is so different from the lost in space disorientation. Those of you who've been in New York recently and looked at Yoshio Taniguchi's new MoMA, which is really, I don't think, very successful, and one is really rather lost in it. This is the production of a space that makes you think, that pauses to make you think. And I want to point out that artists, as usual, are in the avant-garde. Certainly not art historians. My colleagues get very angry at me for saying that, but they're not. And I would say that artists are really quite au point when it comes to understanding the delicacy and the importance of this new research that is coming out. I cite the work, for example, a whole new kind of earthwork that has come out. Andy Goldsworthy, for example, so different from the 1960s, 1970s, you know, macho, heroic earth moving of somebody wonderful, of course, Robert Smithson, but entirely different because it is predicated on slowing us down. It has a kind of delicacy that invites and cajoles, even, if you will, the spectator to watch. It's very interestingly time-based work, spatio-temporal work, where you notice, I mean, it obviously plays to the question of saliency very nicely, because, I mean, the fact that in a natural scene, geometry, I mean, geometries are always eroded by nature, this conical pile of leaves that is something that seizes our attention. It's a law of saliency, and at the same time that it undoes itself, and we watch the undoing. I'll show you here another one of these beautiful ephemeral works that do that. A kind of new phenomenology has also grown up in philosophy to deal with this. Another Andy Goldsworthy, crystalline ice, simply not a dust devil, but a snow devil, which you cannot predict. You notice you have to pay attention because it's unpredictable. There's absolutely no way to know whether it's coming or going, so that it corresponds very much. This is way beyond Merleau-Ponty, but also in contemporary philosophy, a new phenomenology of the transient and the ephemeral event, a situationism, which also exists in certain kinds of contemporary architecture and installation art. You can think of people like Andy Goldsworthy, you can think of Janet Cardiff, new acoustic work that has come out that is totally predicated on an awareness of the subtlety of our perceptual system, the way in which we reckon with the world. There's also a whole new kind of film making out there. Very, very short, taut films. This is by a British filmmaker. It simply shows a fjord in Iceland, and the tiniest, they're almost nano, you want to say micro shifts at the horizon line, where the cloud bank, the horizon line, and the barely stirred ripple of the waves intersect, almost like in a moire pattern. And again, it's absolutely gripping, and I hope you all see there's a kind of connection, even in its abstractness, say, with the Runge that I began with. A more complex piece, a 17-minute, only a 17-minute film, enormously complex by, excuse me, Steve McQueen, called Gravesend, very important. My literary historians will resonate with it right away. It begins, and I'm not showing the video because I don't have enough time to do it. This is the opening scene, and it looks very much like a 19th century slideshow where the sun simply rises and dips under the horizon. The entire film is really about the mining of a very aptly entitled mineral called tantalite. 80% of it comes from Rwanda, and it is, of course, in the hands of Rwandan rebels, but instead of having a political diatribe, you have something infinitely more subtle that's performed. It's a meditation on empire, a fascinating portrait of an ore that goes in the bowels of the earth. There are these very extraordinary shifts. And then, of course, it is the new blood diamond because it is in all of the world's computers. It's used. I mean, that's why it's such an expensive metal. But it's more than that. Gravesend, Michael knows this, is, of course, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It is where Marlowe set sail for the Congo. And McQueen says that this time-lapsed footage, this kind of 19th century slow drop and rise of the sun, not only creates that same mournful, foreboding melancholy that Conrad evokes in the opening paragraphs, but the opening paragraph of Conrad talks of, or speaks, I quote Conrad, is about the imperceptible fall and curve of the sun. So all of that complexity and density, that kind of vertical stratigraphy of meaning is before us in that relatively short, if you're considering we're looking at a film, medium. What all of this drove me to, and I'm still working on it, it took me, this talk really took me all summer sort of to put together, is to create a typology that captures human beings' thinking and asking, what can one learn? What do we have? What might scientists perhaps do to refine the way they ask their questions, and vice versa. And I thought I would begin in a witty fashion. So how do you screw in a light bulb? I mean, that's, of course, what can you tell about thought in looking at this? Well, you can tell a lot. I want to argue that you have inquisitiveness. You have also the look of diagnostics. How in the hell do you do this? What is wrong with something? In other words, there is an enormous, I mean, it's not accidental how many neurons are dedicated to the fusiform face. That is in animals, the work of Frans van der Waal at Emory, for example, on primates. How it's true for primates, it's true for zebrafish. How much of the neural machinery is dedicated to the face and what you can tell from it. But I'm suggesting actually one can tell even more. We can tell from the inside out, but also from the outside in. Then let's take a look at something like this. I'd say all of Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment in this is going to certainly be found at the root of consciousness when they ever get the neural correlates of consciousness together, judgment, that very difficult look of comparison. What is central to judgment that Kant tells us? It is comparison. And you see it in the shift in the eyes. It tells you how important vision is in the neural apparatus. You see thoughtfulness, assessing, and you also see, almost as the two hemispheres connect, rather different sorts of material. It is also a searching look. It's rather different, isn't it, from the screwing in a light bulb. It's not as if you've got the object already in hand, the light bulb, but you are searching for something, for something in between, for something that doesn't yet exist, as Kant would speak of the activity of judgment. I also want to evoke for you the fact that the emotions, the feelings, affect has become a whole industry in the brain sciences. I mean, famously in Antonio Damasio, but he is only one of a host. I mean, whole social cognition is all devoted to questions about the emotions. But do they make the case hard enough? I mean, is the case made hard enough? How are we going to get at something like this? This is a painting by the Emilian contemporary of more famous people than he, although this is a brilliant painting. More famous people than, people like Guercino and Guido Reni. What is it that we're looking at here? It is a work, clearly the emotion here is one not based on impulse. I want to remind you again of that sub rosa, what is running through this talk, voluntaryism, the voluntary, where the will and, if you will, the work of the prefrontal cortex, not just all the reward centers are engaged. The emotions here are not based on automatic reflex. They are also complicated emotions. Of course, Hume realized the importance of those. But this, I want to push it even more, the fact that emotions are mingled. So you can say to me, well, obviously, we're looking at grief, but is that enough? No, it's not enough. It's also remorse, it's regret, and even more than that, in the entire posture, it is about the reviewing of one's entire life in a moment, bringing all of that together in a moment, à la Jean-Pierre Changeux, what I said in the beginning. I can now, of course, say it's Mary Magdalene, but it wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary. You saw it, and it is that complexity that I want to bring. Now, let's also talk about the fact that synesthesia is back. Synesthesia, that great 19th century cross-sensory capacity, which is now being studied again. I show you know George Bernard Shaw as a great dramaturg, but he was also a brilliant photographer. This is a photograph, a portrait he did of Alvin Langdon Coburn in 1906. And I want to get the fact that the emotions also invoke other senses. They possess a weightiness, and not just in English. One talks about ponderation, a heaviness from ponder, from ponderousness. It pulls down. It suggests that you are going somewhere. Something vital inside of you is sinking down. And it's a kind of, I think of it as a sort of inner immigration. Consciousness has immigrated somewhere and you can't quite seize it. One speaks about coming to a weighty decision. In other words, again, evoking qualities, tactility, and so on, and I could go on. One can do the same thing with lighter emotions, even the words levity, which has both an emotional, a volumetric context, but it also has obviously a kind of gaseous, airy, ethereal. It isn't accidental that our languages mimic and copy that. Since scientists are very fond of pathology, I want to say that I think that we can learn a lot on the humanistic side and vice versa if one asks, what is the pathology of the kind of attention that I've been talking about? Well, certainly I think one has to think about voyeurism, and one can sharpen the concept of the voyeur. I think one can come at it in rather a different way. One of the wonderful things that has been discovered from the brain sciences is that the visual cortex and the motor cortex are actually very close together, and the enormous importance of motion, not only to emotion, but to vision, that those things are really inseparable. And what's interesting about the voyeur is one could say that what makes voyeurism unnatural is its freezing and surgically almost separating those two cortices. That is stilling the eye, which should not be stilled, this eye that moves. This is a different kind of lengthy look. I mean, I've been talking about prolonged looking. This is a different concept of prolongation, again, of attention. This is by the contemporary artist Warren Nidich, who, by the way, was trained at Caltech, started out as a cognitive scientist. Not accidental that it works both ways. This is from a piece that he did on voyeurism. I quote also the Austrian Nobel laureate in literature, Elfriede Jelinek, who wrote a very unpleasant but very brilliant book called The Piano Teacher, which is all on female voyeurism. And I quote Jelinek, voyeurism is subjugating the heat of effective life to icy scrutiny. And you notice the temperature component here, too, in terms of what I said about this kind of thinking, looking, or thoughtful, or prolongation. Let me get at the question another way. I'm going to have to skip the erotic. I spoke about agape, but the erotic is enormously important. Let me ask my question differently, the question I started out with. Let me ask the question about voluntary consciousness this way. What are the kinds of things that make us want to most attend in life? Ask yourselves that question. Acute, what are the types of acute wakefulness? What are the things, what might scientists get at if they ask the question, what are the moments that you never want to end? The moments that you want to most stay awake for? I think of these as moments unknown to Steven Pinker, having stood on stage with him actually fairly often. And I want to propose the erotic, le doux regard, as in this Titian painting, as rather a wonderful example of that. From the Roman de la Rose, beautiful concept of sweet looking, le doux regard, which has sweetness as, again, the synesthetic, sweetness as taste. Also suggests a kind of inhalation. And this is from the beautiful book by Mary Carruthers on medieval memory systems, where she writes about the troubadour Roman de la Rose. It's so beautiful, I have to quote it to you, because of course, I mean, Titian continues in his courtly fashion that feudal tradition. This is Mary Carruthers on what I'm getting after from the Roman de la Rose. The more a man gazes on his love, the more burns his heart. it is basted with bacon fat, so the nearer he is to the flame, the more he burns. So this moment then, I mean, again, I'm speaking of moments that become a universe, that endure, that perdure. I could say a great deal about the erotic. I'm not going to do it. I know my time is short. I want to move towards my last section. I also had something to say about thwarting. I just leave all of that. I want to turn to my end, moving. Again, not exactly to the pathologies, but not to something quite like voyeurism, but I want to préciser, as the French say, I want to put forward the subtleties of inattention and what one learns again from my position of outside in about how the mind works. To get at some of the properties and function. In other words, by the reverse, getting at some of the properties and function then of attention. And I want to show you 3 life-size photographs by a brilliant photographer called Ben Jest, and put forward what is this thing called abstraction as a mental category. Boethius writes about it, actually. Abstraction. What is it when we say that someone is abstracted? I'm going to translate that question into more contemporary language and say that abstraction at some level, and all of you know it, if you're designers, you know you have a problem with people paying attention to your designs. I don't care whether it's a client or whether it's you yourself or whether it's the world. Abstraction, if we update that as a concept, is about fading in and out of consciousness. The fact that we are not always there. We are not always here. It is about the whereness of thought. Where is thought in this image? Where is it? Where does thought lie? Where is it located at any given moment? And I'm getting at I fall on the side of the episodic nature of thought, not thought as a continuous narrative, as it is sometimes put forward, but thought as episodic, as something that comes and goes, or if I can put it another way, thought as profoundly distributed. It exists at the periphery. Let me show you my 3 photographs. There are, of course, many, many more. And I ask the question over and over again, where is thought? Where is it? Where is it? I'm going to go back 1. I'd like to propose to you that Jest is interested not so much in the self as some abstract entity, but how we inhabit the self, how we inhabit the self in relation to any particular context or any given moment. His photos are made up of a seamless combination, by the way, of dozens of digital photos of the sitter and their immediate surroundings. And we see that. I mean, he makes you, it's interesting, again, if we think of my larger theme about stopping, work that makes you stop and pay attention. You see it in the unnatural largeness of the hands, the skewing, the tilt of the sidewalk. You also see it in the preternatural clarity of the background, that this is obviously assembled, but obvious only to a certain degree. I mean, it seeps into you the longer you look. And this kind of skewing that he does slows down the otherwise very quickly the fast identifying glance. You know, Malcolm Gladwell's The Blink. I know what it is, or your own George Lakoff, who's so interested actually in chunking, in just, you know, how one simply cuts through the dross and comes to a kind of quintessence image. This slows that process down and does it quite knowledgeably. I think of it as a rather Daniel Dennett kind of photograph because just sitters have become dispersed in things, you know, in a garbage pail handle, a pausing, in between getting in or out of a car. Or if we take a look at this, and you notice, by the way, if you drop a plumb bob line, there is no way that her line of sight actually focuses on the fastening of the bracelet. Where you have sitters that have become dispersed in things, in trappings, in cars, in furniture, in jewelry, they are utterly self-aware and unaware at the same time. And the question is then, where does thought lie as a third-person phenomenon? And I want to distinguish abstraction then from this. This is distraction, and something quite different, and very, very interesting research on that as well for all you multitaskers out there. It used to be said that you could do 50 things at the same time. Well, forget it. I mean, anybody knew that, really. At the equal speed and at the equal level, it is now said that you can barely do 2 things at the same time. And I show you here perhaps something a bit lamentable. It's a contemporary art exhibition, and you notice nobody is looking at the art. They are looking at their cell phones, they are texting, they're smoking, they're typing, they're drinking, they're doing, you know, many, many things. But distraction then as an entity, again, if you will, something that thinking about voluntary attention allows us to revisit these very, very old and very new concepts at the same time. I could go on, I have many other things I might say, but I'm just going to go to my conclusion. What have I been trying to do this evening? I've been trying to make a case in light of the fact that neuroscientists, and I think there's absolutely no disputing them, say that now I think it's estimated that 90% of our brain mechanisms are actually autopoietic. That is, we do what we do unaware. We do what we do, and there's good reason for it. But I am interested in what I would like to call the remaining 10%. My lecture has been on the remaining 10%, asking why is it that we have this capacity, that we have this tiny little stratum that is voluntary. I think ultimately it is very much wrapped up with what Jean-Pierre Changeux was after in the very beginning, that is with memory, but also with this phenomenon that makes us human, consciousness, kind of aware consciousness. So I've been making a larger case, I hope, for what I would call the pedagogy of attentiveness, particularly in the era of what one might say, the era of autopoietic devices, of exactly what we see here, of devices that are either filtering devices where you screen your environment and you don't have to pay attention to anything that's out there, or it is screened very conveniently for you. How many media, and I put the question as a rhetorical question to the audience, I know you can tote them up in your mind, how many media do you think are being designed by the corporations that design them, and believe you me, they have brain scientists on staff, that actually are designed to target very specific systems in the brain that circumvent the prefrontal cortex. In other words, they go directly to the limbic system, they go directly to various reward systems, and there are more and more out there. So that if you consider that we've only got 10% naturally, and that that 10% is being eroded, I want to make a case for the importance of voluntary attentiveness and to build that into our educational system, a pedagogy of attentiveness, a pedagogy of arguing for what Henry James called the real thing, the realness of the moment, and in suggesting some of the ways that we might do it. And I'm going to conclude by a series of paradoxes. Those of you who know me, who know my work, know that I've been a very really passionate speaker for the visual, especially for the visual, although the senses, all the philosophy of the whole philosophy of the senses. But I feel that we've entered really rather a paradoxical era. That is that there is a very curious downplaying of vision in a culture that is supposedly hypermediated and visual. Very, very curious and paradoxical and even ironic. And that part of that irony is driven by the amount of brain research that is devoted to the brain's non-conscious functions. And I'd like to see more devoted to the conscious functions, and I think we have something to contribute to that. In other words, issues that grip the scientists as much as they grip us, because unless it does that, you will never get anywhere, at least so I believe. So first that irony, and then I want to point out another irony, that this curious, inadvertent, almost downplaying of vision is shored up by research from other science areas like chemistry, physics. Think of research topics like on nanostructures, on complexity theory, on smart prosthetics, on genomics. All of them claim to involve imaging. I know it because I serve on NSF panels that deal with science imaging. All of them invoke imaging. But what kind of imaging is it? It is, of course, automatic data acquisition, automatic image recovery, automatic image recording, automatic image display. Is there an executive in there anywhere? Automatic analysis. So finally, it seems to me that we've lost sight of the fact that conscious vision actually dilates. It dilates all this pre-selective processing. And maybe a fundamental question that we can ultimately come together around is, what is the relationship between voluntary and involuntary attention? What is their fundamental connection? What are their roles? And how does one at least ensure that one aspect is not totally dissolved in the other? Attention, and especially voluntary attention, we know from sleep research, is very, very significant for consolidating things. It is that which makes us whole. It's that which happens in sleep, all these frayed, unraveling bits and pieces of stimuli. They become consolidated through attentiveness. So that I want to say again at the conclusion. So I end there. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I would take questions if anybody wants, if anyone.
Nicholas DiMoncho. I teach architecture and urban design. But I'm interested in, through my own work, I've become familiar with the work of the Thomson-Schill lab at UPenn. I don't know if you know their work on the neurology of spatial problem solving. And so, in particular, reference to the topic of environmental and spatial design, to sort of briefly summarize the work, they've shown through functional MRI studies that this particular kind of attention involved in successfully solving spatial problems activates in people who are doing it well, not just the visual cortex, but also various higher functions of memory, but at an automatic level. And people who aren't solving spatial problems well are activating only the visual and sensory components of the brain and not these components of memory. And especially standing next to Donald Linden and his historic speculations on memory and precedent and their role in design, I wonder if you could speculate a bit on how some of these lessons about the connection of memory and sight in spatial problem solving might lead to a different character of conversation than that which design has been having in the last 50 years about specifically related to precedent. And I think it's especially important given the growing mediation of spatial discourse by digital mechanisms which don't inherently give themselves to that kind of thinking.
Right, and have problem, yes, with really the feel of the volumetric. I mean, I don't care how much you rotate. That's a wonderful question because there's also lovely research on place-based neurons, and I think that's where you're heading. One thing I would point you to, and actually I have a whole other lecture on this, I would point you to the new work in prehistory, and particularly cave painting. People like cognitive anthropologists, David Lewis Williams, The Cave in the Mind, is a wonderful book. Also, people who are writing on the debate between, it sounds strange, but it's actually related to this, Neanderthals, the division between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and what was actually created spatially by them. There's a whole new area of prehistory and prehistorical dwellings which takes this new work coming on place-based neurons and developing them. There's also work, if one is interested in the affective experiences in some of these constricted as opposed to open spaces, work on hallucination, which also comes out of mathematics. My colleague Jack Cowan at the University of Chicago, the fact that we know that hallucinations, that actually the geometries that you go through when you have a hallucinatory experience, or for that matter of fact, if you ingest ayahuasca in Peru or in Ecuador, the visions that you experience and the kind of spatial formations that they evoke are actually rather standardized, which is quite fascinating. So that I would say, for your question about the future, how can one take this into the future? I would say that this exciting new work out of prehistory and out of very early, I mean, the new cognitive anthropology, even geography as well, there's also cognitive geography studies, might be a place to go. Does that help your question? I would really recommend that. Stephen Mithen's book, this is the one on singing Neanderthals, is really quite fine because even though it's talking about the musicality of the Neanderthals and a whole new theory of language acquisition, you know, as opposed to Homo sapiens, that it emerges out of music, is really also speaking about space. But David Lewis Williams, who works on the San tribe in South Africa, I would really recommend The Cave in the Mind to you and some of his research. And then Jack Cowan's work on hallucinations. He works with, he's, as I said, a mathematician, but he also works across in the neurosciences. But it's a lovely question. Thank you for that lovely question. Yes.
We met earlier. I'm Tony Cascardi. I'm the director of the Townsend Center.
Yes,
and
yes. I
do work
in the.
I work in between literature and philosophy in that kind of border zone. So this is going to be a question way on the other end of the spectrum. From the very beginning of the talk, with the invocation of Auden and the notion of a kind of awareness that involves attention to something other than myself, all the way throughout the talk, you got extremely close to, but never touched moral philosophy.
Ah, yes.
And it seems to me that there is a critique of a kind of attention that's very similar to what you're elaborating here, that comes out of a certain strand of moral philosophy. I noted you mentioned Henry James at one point. Your colleague or ex-colleague at Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, has written brilliantly on Henry James as the paragon of the very kind of attention that you seem to be talking about.
She is much more, I would say, I of course know Martha, respect her, but we are really on a very different
So that I'd be interested
pole,
to hear.
I would say, because she's such a rationalist. She's such a John Rawlsian, you know.
Or Iris Murdoch would be another one. Who comes out of Plato.
Iris Murdoch,
a very slim, beautiful volume called The Sovereignty of Good relates the moral value of a certain kind of attending and a certain kind of looking that comes out of. So I'd be interested to hear how you range yourself against those kinds of views.
No, I mean, it's a lovely, lovely, I don't claim to be, you know, I don't claim to be the person who has, I don't know, invented attention, but I think I rather come at it from a different perspective. And I would say, Pachin, Martha, that it's rather abstract, her work. Comes, yes, of course, I mean, of course, I understand from Plato, and it is so infused by a kind of legal, I'd say John Rawls, and I'm not a John Rawlsian. I'm not. I've rather a different, I mean, I think all I would say is that I believe that there is material coming to us from the brain sciences that actually might refine Martha's argument. Iris Murdoch, I don't know. I'm also not a vast fan of Iris Murdoch, but that is not to say that these are not wonderful and brilliant people. It's just that their approach, I tend maybe to my approach is maybe more bottom-up sensory, you know. But it doesn't obviate your question. I'm simply saying, yes, they write about it, but I think I'm proposing that there is a dimension that they really miss. She would not be, nor would John Rawls be, quite so rational if this new work that really one could call the new philosophy of the senses was taken in. I really fall more, I mean, I'm trained, I actually have a degree in philosophy, continental philosophy, so I come out of that, and maybe I'm showing, the tiger is showing her stripes, you know, that I just admit it, I confess it, but do you see what I'm saying? I'm saying that I'm not denying it. I think, however, if I may push one, there is a whole new strand in religious studies now, which is not anymore sort of academic divinity, you know, theology, but actually is going back to ritual and performance theory. There, I think, would be a lead-in to the moral philosophy in a different way. Community, the way, for example, the body becomes engaged communally with others. That's not a Rawlsian perspective. I mean, he is very top-down. I'm suggesting maybe another way. This is not denying the importance of anything you say, but simply proposing that I think I'm getting at something else and bringing something else to the table. So.
You work very much from the bottom up in that unique direction. I suppose I was suggesting that there's an import of the talk.
There's a what?
There's an import of the talk.
I see. Well, I do it in the last chapter of Echo Objects actually is on the free will, the debate around the free will. And I do read, believe it or not, I mean, I never used to read analytical philosophy. I now read a fair amount. And especially the guys that are interested in the episodic, I mean, also interested in people like Andy Clark, you know, who sort of bridges. So I thank you then. I see you're paying me a compliment. I was taking it as you were giving me a well-deserved, you didn't do it right, but I do admire those people. It's just, I think it's not enough, if I may put it that way.
Other questions? Questions? I'm an architect or architectural theorist. Want to go to the mic?
Belt it out.
You started the talk by saying you were interested in the vanishing of selective attention.
Yes.
And I'm interested in hearing what you think the trend is, because clearly your work goes far deeper than the common critique of contemporary youth culture.
Oh, no, I mean, that's not what this is, because as I said, I find gaming is rather interesting.
But I'm interested in hearing what evidence you have, either from the neuropsychology or maybe from the arts, that demonstrate a change in the notion of selective attention in the last century, in the last 20 years. If we're 90-10 now, were we 20-80 10 years ago?
I don't know. No, I'd be happy if we guard the 10, you know. But I think I mean, are you asking me what is the evidence for the vanishing? Well, I think certainly all the new I think a lot of things, you know, from Bose headsets, as I said, to, you know, all the filtering devices and so on. I mean, how many devices, just ask yourself, how many devices target certain systems in the brain and exclude others? I mean, how many filtering devices are there in the environment? Think about the iPhone. Think about the iPhone. I'm surprised actually in Japan that half that nation is not dead, since everybody is glued in Tokyo. I mean, no, just look at how people do not attend. I mean, I think it is a vanishing entity. And if you ask me, and my point is also so much of brain research, we need to get some of the scientists actually to work on voluntary. That was my ending point. So much research, like in neuroeconomics. I mean, University of Chicago is a perfect example, to my horror, law and economics, you know, dedicated to, you know, just what is the psychology of the blink? What is the response to the market? You know, like this. And it is that peculiar getting into bed together of those various computationally oriented fields that I think is really, and as I pointed out too, imaging technologies also that favor automaticity. I mean, I think there's much evidence, both culturally and in terms of the kinds of research that gets done, that maybe there's an overweening attention to our involuntary responses. And I actually even tried to do a little bit of a parsing out of inattention, which needs to get done as well, you know, in my paper. So I don't know what more I can quite say about that. Well, of course, I mean, well, it's not all the same, obviously. Aren't you? I mean, aren't you? I mean, I'm asking you. I mean, no, but I'm asking you just in terms of how you would pay attention. I mean, how do you...
It doesn't seem like it to me, but that's my phenomenal...
Do you, I mean, if one asks, I mean, you guys are urban designers. Who pays, why does... I mean, one question one might ask, with all of these things grabbing our eye, grabbing our touch, grabbing our thumbs, is it any wonder that the built environment is going to hell? I mean, at some level? I mean, I mean, one can ask, who is paying attention to the ambient? And I want to invoke a very old-fashioned word, the ambiance, the ambient, the atmosphere. Who in the hell is paying attention to that? I'm going to be of course, this is why I'm always in trouble. What the hell? You know, but there is, of course, this theory that goes back to antiquity about creativity, and the Romantics take it on, at least one school of the Romantics, you know, that creativity is, you know, giving rein to your imagination, and you just, you know, you kind of, you know, you go with it and you let the flow and effluvia. But I'm going to say that creativity now, real creativity, is paying attention to one's surroundings. I mean, to this patch that is here. And I'm not a Luddite. I am not a Luddite. I mean, I'm going to Georgia Tech, 9 schools of engineering, and they're paying 1/3 of my salary, and to help them rethink their educational program. I mean, engineering as well, in this new way. So I'm not a Luddite. But I'm saying there are devices and there are devices. And I'm just I'm asking you, just do the thought experiment. Think about how many of the devices that you use put you on automatic pilot. Think of that. And of course, the question then comes, why is that so pleasant? Why do we call those centers of the brain reward systems? Isn't that an interesting term? Gerald Edelman, whom I know and visited in San Diego. I talked a bit about that as well. This is really interesting. They call it reward systems because there's a pleasure principle that comes there too. So that needs to be asked too. So I just throw the question back to you that way.
But where does the social body come into this? I mean, this isn't all individual.
Who said it was all individual?
I mean, you have an iPhone that's attractive because your peers say it's attractive to have an iPhone to some degree. If no one else is on Facebook, you're not going to have much fun. So it seems
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just tell me. I'm sorry. I don't.
Everything that was discussed so far is to be individual.
Well, no. I spoke about the social. I mean, this whole talk is about the social. It's you are not just paying. I mean, we're not talking solipsism here. That's not attention. Attention is paying attention to somebody else.
Where is this constructed?
What do you mean, where is it constructed?
Well, the need for an iPhone.
Where is it constructed? It's constructed by desire, well, it's a good question. It's constructed. It comes also out of biology. I mean, there are pleasure centers. There are things that drive. I mean, I'm interested in getting biology and culture together. I mean, I'm not a social constructionist in the sense that social construction is everything. I think biology and culture have to come back together again. And there are obviously, and it's a reason we need to know about it, there are obviously things that go back to fight and flee, to quick response, to evolution. You know, there are many, many reasons that these systems exist in the brain. The question is, and the answer to it, I'll give you a social answer, I'll give you a neural-Darwinist answer, I'll give you a Gerald Edelman answer. Gerald Edelman thinks about this quite a bit, and he makes a very important distinction between what he calls the primary repertoire, which is what we're born with, and the secondary repertoire, which gets pruned and which each individual prunes with experience. That's why it's a Darwinian experience. It's not just simply hardwired. There's a back and forth, a vis-a-vis with the environment. And the important thing about Edelman's theory, which you can read in, I mean, it's a number of rather wonderful books, from beginning with The Remembered Present, which was one of his earlier ones, but I recommend the one that takes Emily Dickinson phrase for the title, Wider Than the Sky. He talks about the fact that what goes out doesn't come back into us in the same way. It comes back intensified. And if you think how desires, that's why it's important to know about how these things work in different individuals. That is the way in which these reward systems get keyed up, what I said earlier about extreme addiction, the way the nervous system gets stretched, it doesn't go back to its original position, which means that you then require more and more of what pleases you originally, and so it goes. Read Gerald Edelman, I would say, and you would have a bit more of more than I could give you this evening along those lines. But I would certainly say that has an enormous amount to do with the shapes of our societies today. I mean, this really gives you I think, a profound insight into why the extreming of so many experiences is occurring, and the way in which certain kinds of media also push that. Other things push it too, but certainly certain kinds of media do. So that's what I would. I'm going to require gin soon. Yes, go on.
My name is Stephen Stout. I'm a visual artist.
I'm sorry, could you speak into the mic? Thank you.
My name is Stephen Stout. I'm a visual artist.
Yes.
And I wanted to know what you thought of the work of Olafur Eliasson, and if you feel that he's
I
successfully
know
addressing.
I mean, I visited his studio in Berlin. I think he is quite interesting. And Olafur's work, since we're speaking also philosophy, since that was raised, and I thank you for raising that, Olafur fits very much into something that one can call the new phenomenology. It's very interesting that there's a whole new philosophy out there, which is, speaking of solipsism, rather solipsistic. In other words, the phenomenology, it comes out of, it's a kind of extreming of Changeux's global workspace theory. and it devolves from the concept that there is no I on the stage of consciousness anymore, that actually it's all these systems, these neural systems, that project upward and create this kind of illusion of one and identity. And this hyper-illusionism has become a kind of internal phenomenology, not, as I said, quite different from Merleau-Ponty or Husserl. And I would say that Olafur's work, particularly the one he did, you know, the famous The Burning Sun, you know, with the mirrors at the Contemporary Tate,
yeah.
the weather station at the Contemporary Tate. That's a perfect example of that kind of solipsism, that hyper-illusionizing that also you can find in certain philosophers, certain new phenomenologists out there that would make that argument, that everything is an epiphenomenon. It's really quite an interesting argument, and I've gotten back into it, into my philosophical roots because of that. Olafur is quite good at that.
I find it really interesting that the title of his work is, well, the last show was Take Your Time. And
yes, Take Your Time.
It reminds me a lot of what
you
talk about.
Yes, I did. I actually spoke for that installation. Yes, take your time, but stay in the experience. It's rather interesting. I mean, much to be thought about there. I have a book I can recommend to you there, too, called, interestingly, Being No One, published by MIT, which in a way outlines, it's actually written by a neuroscientist but also a neurophilosopher at the same time, which speaks to this kind of new phenomenology, kind of outlines it. So you might want to take a look at that.
Thank you.
We have one more question.
Yes, please, otherwise I need a drink. Yes, no, I'm happy.
My question, I
you
hope.
guys asking me hard questions.
Well, I hope mine will be simple and easy for you. I'm in architecture, but my question is really coming out of what are called the somatic practices, the mind-body integration realm.
Yes.
And because I've been teaching in this realm for a couple of decades, I've been using the model of the triune structure of the brain. But here at Berkeley, I met some neuroscientist PhD students who told me, you know, that's kind of an old-fashioned formulation now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when I spoke with Jeff Weiner on this campus, who is just died this fall, but just before he died, I asked him, is it an inaccurate construction? And he said, no, it's not inaccurate. It's just that we know more now, but it's still a perfectly usable model. My question to you is, do you still use that model, or how do you view it?
No, because I think, since I invoked Gerald Edelman, you see, it's very difficult. I mean, even memory, if we think of the importance of memory, you know, I mean, memory had a particular, and it goes back to Aristotle, I mean, that kind of, and then we think of the great Thomists, I mean, St. Thomas, you know, these lovely developments, the scholastics and so on, of the beautiful faculty of psychology, which then really reached its efflorescence, I think, with Hume, and then Kant really sort of, in a way, just he is the apotheosis and the dismantler of it at the same time. But I would say that one thing that this early book, The Remembered Present, by Gerald Edelman, shows is that memory, for example, is always fringing, and I'm going to use William James terminology because it's also, these people are also, William James has become a whole new industry as well, that the present is always fringed with memory, so that memory isn't the second storehouse or treasury that it used to be.
Well, it's supposedly,
you know, when these things were
it's in all three systems, but so you're saying because
so interrelated, they no longer possess, or the Neoplatonists, great Neoplatonists also, who there is, you know, there is this kind of, I want to use almost an archaeological language for the brain, the way it was conceived. That, what now, it's lateral, cross-connecting and deep, so it's much more a nexus concept, and it really does change.
Well, I'll just say there is a very recent book.
But you're asking me my
Okay.
That's all I can say.
There's a recent book called The Accidental Brain that talks about the brain still as 3 ice cream cones, 3 scoops of ice cream. They still are using that metaphor. So I'm interested that you're not. So it,
I think that's a great note to end on. Freud is in deep trouble. Barbara, thank you very much.